All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Unlocking Greatness. There have only been a few times that you guys have heard me over hundreds of episodes say how fired up I was to have a conversation with a guest. One of those, if you recall, was just not too long ago, about 6 months ago. I had John Eldridge on the podcast. We had an incredible conversation talking about manhood and masculinity. And I absolutely love that because of how much I admire John. Today is going to be another one of those discussions. If you're looking at him, you may recognize his face if you've been a part of evangelical Christianity for any period of time. But Tullian Tchividjian, we just rehearsed his name offline, and I already screwed up the last name. But he has an incredible story. So about a decade and a half ago, maybe a little bit longer, he planted a church, quickly rose to what, I hate to use this word, but was stardom and great influence in Christian circles for the movement that he created, which was so deeply entrenched in this idea of the grace of God, which is so profound in all of Scripture. If you've followed his story for any period of time, you know that Tullian would come to admit that he had an affair, and in doing so, every bit of that message and every bit of the church that fell in love with him for that, or I'll say the most of the church that fell in love with him for that, turned his back on him. And it was just disgusting to see. And yet, through that season, he repented, he just re-engaged, he grew, he learned, he poured himself back into the people, the church that had pushed themselves away from him. And he's written an incredible book called Carnage Grace. I was fortunate to read a pre-released copy of that. I cannot wait for you guys to read that book. Anyway, that's a long introduction. I've got him here right now. What's up, man? Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me. And listen, you got the last name right, Tchividjian, but you screwed up the first name.
Oh,
Tullian. Tullian. My mom named me after an early church father by the name of Tullian, who she was studying when she was pregnant with me. And she just fell in love with this guy. And so she prayed and said, God, if this child that I'm carrying happens to be a boy, I want him to be just like Tullian. So she named me. Rumor has it that for the first few days I was alive, it was Tullian Tchividjian, and thankfully she dropped the tur, so it's just Tullian. But yeah, people look at my name and they're like, "Man, where are you from?" Like they think I'm from a galaxy far, far away based on my name. I'm like, actually, I'm a Florida native, born in Jacksonville, raised in Fort Lauderdale, been in Florida most of my life. So I just carry around this laborious first and last name that causes people to question whether or not I'm from this planet.
Well, and it's more of a problem because in all the years that I followed you, I've always said Tullian, and I would even have called him Tertullian when I read about him. So I talk about a set up for disaster.
So now you've been corrected. Now you know how to say both of our names.
Oh, man. Okay. So I had an opportunity to read your book. I was actually I've been in the midst of a lot of travel. I was on an airplane. I found myself weeping so many different times, both because I felt myself in so much of your story. I shared with you offline that I nearly had an affair on my wife, and just the pattern and path that led me to that was so profound. And one of the things that I've tried to preach to so many people is that the reason why I'm so open now is because I want to go first. And you have this quote smack dab in the middle of the book that I want to read, and then I want to have you respond to, and then we'll just kind of get going, that I think was so profound that I want people to hear. And so you're talking about the fact that you've been so open and so honest about the affair, all of the hiding it, all of the struggles. And then you said this, you said, trust me, those parts of you that are most fearful of disclosing, the parts of you that get jealous, the parts of you that are greedy, the parts of you that lust for what you don't have, the parts of you that are scared shitless, the parts of you that thirst for vengeance, the parts of you that are painfully insecure, those are the very parts that will be most helpful to people if you admit them. opening up about your struggles helps people so much more than talking about your strengths. People may be somewhat inspired when you share your successes with them, but they connect with you and feel less alone when you share your failures with them. It gives them hope. So you said that. You've reflected on that probably more times than you would love to at this point in your life. But how do you get to a place where you feel where you're able to say that honestly? Because I think that it's easy to say, sure, I'll admit to failure. I mean, we live in a society today that over glorifies failure. It's like, let's be proud to fail. Gary Vaynerchuk, who's a very popular marketing influencer, always talks about the fact that he loves to fail. I don't think that's really true, but you had to get to this place. And so how did you get there to be able to be honest about saying something like that?
Yeah, so it was nearly 10 years ago now, 9 years ago to be exact, that everything came crashing down for me. I was unfaithful to my first wife a couple of times, some more serious than others, and it all caught up with me in 2015, spring, early summer of 2015. And as a result of that, because I was a public person and had a public platform, all of that played out very publicly. I come from a famous family. I was leading a large, famous church. I had written a book a year for 8 years or so. I mean, I was at the time, I was at the top of my game. A popular guy, an in-demand guy. And I've done a lot of reflection on how I went from there to rock bottom. But there is a connection between those things. I've often said that failure is far less toxic to the soul than success is. Because when you're successful, you start to believe your own press. You start to buy into your own sense of self-sufficiency. And that's when you start skating on some really thin ice. So all of that came crashing down. I lost everything. I mean, everything. I went through a painful divorce. My first wife and I had 3 kids together. 2 of them were older and out of the house already. One, my youngest daughter, was still at home. So she really got I mean, they all suffered because of it, but she really got the brunt of it. She was entering into high school when all of that went down. So I was absolutely heartbroken and guilt-ridden about how much hurt I had caused my kids. My first wife and I had been married for 21 years, together for 23. We basically grew up together, met when we were 18 years old. And while and I talk about this in the book, that, while our marriage wasn't easy, no marriage is, it wasn't bad. We have a lot of happy memories together. It wasn't like this super bad marriage at all. But beginning, and I outlined this in the book, beginning in 2012 is where I kind of mark the drift starting to happen. And there were just a series of events that took place between 2012, 2015 that landed me at rock bottom. And so I obviously lost my job, lost my reputation, book deals were canceled, speaking engagements were canceled. And all of that was painful. I think the greatest pain was the shame and guilt and regret I felt because of how I hurt my first wife and my 3 kids. That was by far the deepest pain I had. All of the other stuff was important to me, and I was sorry to lose all of that and sorry to let a lot of people down. There were a lot of people that looked to me to be a leader, a helper, someone that, a counselor, a spiritual leader. And, I blew it. So it wasn't just my first wife and my kids that I let down. I let down a lot of people, but my letdown of my first wife and my kids was the one that was by far the most painful. So I beginning in the summer of 2015, through, I would say, probably the fall of 2017, maybe the late fall of 2017, I was undergoing a massive, massive identity crisis. I got remarried in August of 2016 to my wife, Stacy. We've been married for 7.5 years now. And if it wasn't for her, I would probably be dead, literally. And God dropped her into my life at the perfect time. I talk about this in the book. It was scandalous to people who knew me because my divorce wasn't final yet. It was going to be, but it wasn't final yet. I was just on the heels of this massive scandal, this, publicized scandal. So, to sort of develop a romantic relationship with someone during that time was not only unwise, it was flat out foolish. And yet God knows how to work with and through and in spite of us, thankfully. Yeah. And so I look back now and go, God knew what he was doing. If he hadn't dropped Stacy in my lap at that time, I probably wouldn't be here today. But even after her and I met and got married, I was undergoing, like I said, a massive identity crisis. I didn't realize it at the time, but I had attached so much of my worth and my value and my significance and my security in my career, my success, the people that I knew, the people that knew me, my network, all of that stuff. So when all of that stuff was gone, it's like I didn't know who I was anymore. And I was in my early 40s at the time. And that's a scary place to be in your early 40s. And for a while, I sort of took it on the chin, accepted it, because I was like, you know what? You screwed up, and there are consequences to screwing up, and this is what you get. But after a year or more of that, that's when I really started to get mad at God. Like, dude, I remember praying, God, I know people who have done a hell of a lot worse than me, who are suffering a hell of a lot less than me. Like, you're not a good friend. I remember having FU conversations with God. Some of my most honest prayers during that season were those kinds of prayers. And it actually brought those conversations between God and I actually brought us much closer than we had ever been. I was being brutally honest. And so as I sort of emerged from that season, I started sensing a call to write again. And I didn't know what that was going to be. I didn't know what that was going to look like. I had no idea how I was going to spend the rest of my life. Being a pastor was so far removed from what, number one, because I was thinking, okay, no church is going to hire me because
right.
I've been blackballed, so that's not going to happen. I had no desire to start a church. I didn't even want to be associated with Christians, to be honest with you. I really didn't. I think a lot of, when the shit hits the fan, Christians are the first to run for the exits, sadly. And not only, that's not just my experience, but the experience of many people that I've been in touch with. So I didn't want to connect myself to a group of people who were going to bail if I blew it again. So I wasn't interested in starting a church, none of that, but I did feel a call to write. And so I started writing, and I not for publication. I just started writing. I started taking notes on my phone, popping open my laptop, starting to write, reflecting. I was far removed enough from the initial crash that I was able to reflect on how it all happened, but more so, it was sort of my writing at that time was kind of almost like a diary of what I was currently feeling in the aftermath of that implosion, in the aftermath of bottoming out. And my writing was really, I've always loved to write, but this was really raw, and it was very stream of consciousness, and it was some of the realist writing that I had done. So a good friend of mine, said, I'd be happy to build you a website if you would like, and you can start publishing this stuff. And I was scared shitless. I really was, because at that time, anytime I popped my head out for anything, people would come and attack and remind me of what I had done and do their best to remind the world as to what I had done. So I was nervous about putting any of this stuff out there publicly, but I had some good counseling at that time in my life, and everybody said, "No, I think this is what you should do." So I started. My friend built a website. I started publishing this stuff, and the response was unbelievable, man. Like shocking. I think I had been quiet for a while, so I think some of it was just curiosity as to what happened to this guy and what's he doing now and where is he and that sort of thing. But there was also a difference to my writing. It was very, like I said, very raw, very honest, very unedited. And part of that calling that I sensed, that summons that I sensed from God to write again, wasn't to write about anything. It was to write about something very specific, and that was to tell the truth about myself in as unedited a way as possible, while at the same time protecting other people that were a part of my story. I mean, I wasn't the only one who sinned in my story, but I couldn't talk about theirs. I needed to focus on mine. It was, I wanted to tell my story, not their story. And so it was very, very real. It was raw. And that was really what I sensed God calling me to do. Show how I want you to write about how my grace met you and continues to meet you in the dark corners of your life.
Yeah.
And so I did. I told lots of really honest stories about the effect that my crash and burn had on my kids. I mean, there are still things that I will, and I put a lot of this stuff in the book, but there are still things that I read that I wrote during that time that I can't get all the way through. Yeah. Not only because I was writing about something that was super raw, but my writing itself was raw.
Well, and not to interrupt, there was one key moment that I remember in there that I started crying, like outright crying on the plane. And you were recounting a time when you were with your daughter, youngest daughter, it sounded like, in the car, and you guys were singing along to a song, and she started to cry. And when you asked her why, her response to you was something to the effect of like, "Why did you ruin our family?" Right. I mean, that, as a father, and again, I don't know you at all other than what I've seen from a distance, but you seem like a guy that will go to the ends of the earth for your children, and you would fight to protect them. And so, like, in a moment like that, when your child is rightfully accusing you of doing something that they feel like just has destroyed their life, that has to eat at you forever. I mean, we believe that God's grace, his mercy, his redemption is incredibly powerful. And yet we also know the reality that, like, wounds like that never completely heal this side of heaven. No, they don't. That was an incredibly potent and powerful moment for me. And it was so potent and so powerful that I felt the need to write about it, because as I wrote and as I put this stuff out there on this website that this friend built for me, the responses that kept coming in were coming in from people whose circumstances may have been different than mine, but who had experienced regret, loss, shame, guilt, fear, insecurity in the same ways that I did. And I realized at the time, this world is filled with people just like me. People who wake up every morning hoping that what they just experienced was a nightmare, when in reality it's their life. People who question whether anybody could love them, even God, because of the things they've done and the hurt they've caused. People who wonder whether they'll ever be happy again. People who grieve the loss of intimate relationships, all of that stuff. And I felt all of that. I think there's a distinction between sympathy and empathy. Both are good, but sympathy is essentially you sitting down with me and sort of unburdening yourself, and me going, "Man, I hear what you're saying." Empathy is you sitting down with me and unburdening yourself, and me going, "Man, I feel what you're feeling because I've been in that exact same spot." And I think because of my crash and burn, my bottoming out, my failure,
and the desperation I felt on the heels of that, the loss that I felt, the sadness, the fear, the insecurity, the regret, the shame, the way that I hurt people, all of that stuff, it developed over time a deep empathy in me for other people. You don't want to have to really fail miserably to develop empathy, but I think people who have deep empathy for others are people who have, in some way, shape, or form, failed miserably and have suffered the consequences of that. And so I felt, even though attacks came when I started writing again, those attacks were quickly silenced in my mind because of the overwhelming response of people who felt just as desperate as I did. I had a guy, for instance, and I think I put this in the book, but I had a guy. I was sitting on my couch one night, Stacy and I were sitting there, and I got an email from a guy who I'd never met. He introduced himself to me and just said, you don't know me, but I've been a pastor for many years of one of the largest churches in my denomination. I've been on all of the denominational boards that my denomination has. I'm an accomplished author, written a lot of books, blah, blah, blah. And he said 18 months ago, my son-in-law discovered on my laptop, went into my history and discovered that I had been in some same-sex chat rooms. And he said, I went to my son-in-law went to the church, went to my wife divorced me, I lost my job, lost all my friends, haven't talked to my kids in 18 months, and I am currently sitting in a one-bedroom apartment outside of Cleveland, Ohio, essentially ready to take my life. And this guy was probably in his 60s, and just said, I sort of need a reason to keep living. And so those are the kind of stories that I would get from people as a result of going first, putting my story out there. So when you recognize that, okay, God hasn't taken away my ministry, but he's changed it. Yeah. And now I see myself as sort of an empathetic fellow struggler with people who feel lost, people who are keenly aware of their brokenness and feel hopeless. And there are so many people out there like that. And so I really, I kind of see myself as a misfit in the religious world. I told you before we started that, I'm not a religious guy. I'm not even really a church guy. And that's not because I don't believe in God or believe in God's grace. I've just always felt like a square peg in a round hole in like religious church circles. And so when I get this kind of response from people, I feel like, wow, there are a lot of other misfits out there too. I'm kind of a misfit that belongs to the other misfits, the ones hanging out at the back of the room who don't know where they fit. Those are my people. Yeah. And I've spent a lot of time in the last 5 or 6 years with people in recovery circles. I get invited to speak at recovery places. And I'm telling you, man, every single time I'm sitting with people who are struggling with alcohol abuse, drug abuse, sexual addiction, whatever the case may be, every time I'm sitting around in a circle with those kinds of people, I feel so much more at home, even though I've never had sort of a substance abuse problem or one of those typical addictions. I mean, I think we're all addicts. We all have an unhealthy relationship with something, but my addictions were not the typical addictions. And yet I felt so much more camaraderie and community in recovery places than I ever did at church. It's so much more refreshing to sit with a group of people who know that they're broken than to sit with a group of people who think that they're not. And I've discovered that in a lot of church circles, people may give lip service to, I'm a sinner and I'm broken and I need grace. But when it really comes down to it, they're still shocked by sin, whether their own or other people's. And so I talk a lot about that in the book, about how, sort of my own crash and burn lowered my expectations of sinners. I expect sinners to sin. I expect broken people to break things. I expect fallen people to fall down. And, I think I shocked myself when I crashed and burned in the way that I did. And it shouldn't have been a shock. It doesn't mean that, not that it shouldn't have been a shock in the sense that I hurt a lot of people and all that stuff. But I mean, I should have known myself well enough to know I'm capable of doing this. The very fact that I did it proved that at some level I didn't believe I was capable of doing it. And so I just, I've changed. And what's interesting, I was on a podcast interview last week and the guy said, has your theology changed since before your crash and burn? And I said, actually, it hasn't. It's actually gotten deeper and become more real. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, I had one bullet in my gun as a writer and preacher before my crash and burn, and that was the radicality of God's grace, which is so much bigger and brighter than anything we could ever imagine. And while I believed that then, there is something about bottoming out, crashing and burning that forces you to reckon with the reality of God's grace in a way that you never had to before. And so my message is the same, but the messenger's different. I'm a different guy than I was before. And the people that I minister to, I think now are a bit different.
Well, you talked about that. There was another quote I wrote down. I rarely take notes, by the way, but there was something about some of these things that were so simply profound. You said grace doesn't really prevail until we run out of steam. And I hadn't arrived at the place where I was out of aces. And I think that that's so freaking nuts because, again, like we talked about this offline a little bit, at the beginning. It's like you were the grace dude. I mean, you were getting attacked from inside Christianity for being no law and all grace. I remember hearing it time and time again. Yeah. And so at the same time, it was like you didn't really get to experience the grace of God until your life completely unraveled. Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that is so scary inside of Christianity for sure. It's like you don't even get it. You don't get God's grace. You don't really understand how magnificent the cross of Christ is until you are able to reconcile with the fact that you have already at least once destroyed your life. You were dead in your own trespass and sin, or you are, as the famous hymn, Come Thou Fount says, prone to wander, Lord, I feel it, right? It's like until we get that, I don't think we can absorb just how powerful the grace of God is because, especially in Western Christianity, we don't really need it.
Yeah. Yeah, and that is scary. I've been asked a lot of times, okay, so how do you arrive at the place of understanding God's grace the way you now understand it without bottoming out? And my answer to that is I don't think you can. I really don't think you can. And I don't mean bottoming out in some catastrophic way. I'm not saying you got to have an affair in order to discover God. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about circumstances that force you to reckon with the fact that you are a broken person capable of the most heinous sins imaginable. Yep. That you are way more selfish than you think you are. You're way more egotistical than you think you are. You're way more insecure than you think you are. You're way more fearful than you think you are. You're far less faithful than you think you are. You're far less devoted to God than you think you are. And until you can arrive at that place, grace is something that you might give lip service to. It might be something that you believe in intellectually. But existentially, experientially, it's not going to feel real to you. And in my case, and I think God's mercy is oftentimes severe, and I think He allows us to experience seasons in life or circumstances or things that happen that get us to rock bottom in one way, shape, or form so that we will understand His grace. I mean, one example, I think I'm more forgiving now, far less likely to hold a grudge now than I used to be. And that's not because I've been reading books on how to be a better forgiver. That's not because I've been listening to sermons on how to forgive, 5 ways in order to become a better forgiver. I haven't been seeking to be better at forgiveness at all. I've just been, my failure has so forced me to reckon with God's forgiveness of me. The fact that God never left me, the fact that he never blinked, he never bailed, and I gave him every reason in the world to do so. And the fact that he never stopped delighting in me, even when I was at my worst, has sort of, just soaking in the hot tub of that truth has just sort of made me more forgiving without even trying. And this was, ironically, this was one of the things that I was saying before I crashed and burned. I would get in these public debates with people about sanctification, the pursuit of holiness, all that kind of stuff, and how there's a lack of that in my preaching. And I would always respond by saying, you think that growth happens by talking about growth. I think growth happens when you crash and burn and come face to face with how radical God's grace and acceptance of you is. Right. And that is what changes you. Yep. And so I think that's what it is. I've been, people say, well, how did you get from where you were to where you are now? And, to the point where you're now leading this church in Jupiter, Florida, and you've written this book. And like, I'm in a season where I'm at rock bottom and I want to get to where you are. And I'm like, dude, I didn't get from there to here because I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, got folk. I mean, I'm just, dude, I don't even remember really how I got from there to here. I just know that God picked me up as a broken, jacked up dude and brought me here. And, I've said, and I say this in the book, I am here today and alive, not because in my darkest moments I held on to God. I am here today and alive because in my darkest moments, God never let go of me. I let go of him all the time. Yeah. So it's his friendship, his loyalty, his devotion to me that has me where I am today. And that is, that's emboldening to your faith. To go, I've given God every reason in the world to walk away from me, and he's never budged, never. I watched a lot of other people walk away. I also say in the book, it's very difficult to know who your friends are when you're at the top because you have so much to offer and people benefit from being around you. But when you're at the bottom and all you have to offer people is leprosy and liability, you discover pretty quickly how few friends you actually have. And sadly, I discovered I didn't have a lot of friends. I had colleagues, people who, we were all sort of moving in the same network, in the same circle, but I didn't have a lot of friends. And that too, I think, is a result of the church not honing in on this message of grace. Messages of grace tend to create cultures of grace, which tend to create and form people of grace. And so there's a huge difference between grace on paper and grace in practice. And, I sadly discovered that, but it's changed me, I think, in a much better way.
Okay. So, before we turn this message more positively in the right direction and not just talk about the beautiful fall of you over time. So you shared a couple of different moments, and you even spoke to them now of so you were welcomed back into another church shortly after everything happened, and then last minute they kind of cast you out and kicked you out. There were some people that thought maybe they were going to walk this road back with you, and then you were pushed out. And then even from a distance, people would say, and you brought this up earlier, man, he had this epic disaster in his first marriage. How could he get married so quickly? Or he had this massive fall from pastoral leadership. How could he start another church at all ever again? And so how do you understand this idea of we need to like sin is sin, and it's what nailed Jesus to the cross. Like, so there's this penalty that must be paid. We need to feel a sense of guilt, and even I say there's a healthy shame involved at times in sin. So like, there's a penalty. We need to wear that. We need to eat that. There's a period of time of repentance and reconciliation and redemption, but at the same time, we can't stop giving people this beautiful message of the Father is waiting for the lost son to come back, right? Mm-hmm. And you share that parable too, which is so amazing. Like, so how do you walk that road with people? Because you don't want to, I don't like to use this term, but you don't want to let people off the hook. It's like, you just committed some awful sin, or forget that. You just committed some small sin. Like, you can't excuse that, because we don't want people walking around just ruthlessly committing sin. At the same time, we want to give people the love and grace of Jesus that allows them to see how good God is. So how do you do that now?
Yeah, well, it's simple. Not easy, but simple to me. And I get this from my granddad. And this is sort of a summary of something he once said. But at the end of the day, it's God's job to change people, and it's our job to love them, period, full stop. I think we get ourselves in a jam when we think it's our responsibility to change people. So one of the things that I say whenever I hear people talk about, well, we can't let people off, scot-free. I'm like, trust me, they're not being let off scot-free. The consequences of what there is no church discipline process that would have been as effective in changing me and getting me to a place of owning my shit, like the consequences I was experiencing. Consequences are the primary tool of discipline I believe God uses. I mean, I didn't need anybody reminding me of what I had done to blow up my life and the lives of those that I love. I knew it, and that's what I was wrestling with on a daily basis. What I needed at the time was people reminding me that, the sins I can't forget, God chooses not to remember. Mm-hmm. And so I on the one hand, I recognize that everybody is walking around as a broken person living in a broken world with other broken people. We break things, whether we're conscious of it or not. We break things. I have a friend named Jean Leroux who says, if you're not the worst person you don't know yourself very well. He's right. I think that we are all, it's like this old Presbyterian minister, Jack Miller, used to say, cheer up, you're a lot worse off than you think you are, but God's grace is infinitely greater than anything you could ever hope for or imagine. So I kind of leave, in general, now each situation has some specific nuances that may require different action. But in general, my posture is I leave consequences and all of that stuff up to God. God is the only one that can actually do the work in a human heart that is wandering from him, that is running from him. Only God. The father in the parable of the prodigal son didn't chase after his son, and when his son finally came back, he didn't require his son to go through a laundry list of things to prove that he was truly sorry. The very fact that he came home was a demonstration enough that he understood at some level what he had done and the damage he had caused. So the way that I tell people all the time, the best way to handle prodigals, people in your life who have wandered off the reservation, the best way to handle them is to let them go, pray for their return, and when you see them on the horizon, head hung low and hunched, walking towards you, you run to them, you meet them, you hug them, and you welcome them back. No questions asked. And that, I think, requires a lot of faith that God is the one doing the work. Repentance is not our work. Repentance is also a gift from God. I couldn't repent from anything if God didn't give me the gift of repentance. I couldn't exercise faith in anything if God didn't give me the gift of faith. So it really goes back to do I trust that God is doing something in the life of this person that I can't see and that I have to leave up to him? So when my granddad said, listen, it's God's job to change people and it's our job to love them. And if and when people change, the thing that God will most likely use to change them is our love for them. So I expect, like I said, I expect sinners to sin. I expect broken people to break things. I expect fallen people to fall down. That's what makes me a super safe guy to confess your darkest secrets to, because I'm not shocked by any of it, like none of it. Someone, I mean,
okay,
trust me.
So pause on that. I think that is something that I think is missing. And you spoke to this a few different times in our conversation, talking about the fact that those in leadership are often hiding behind the truth of what they're really dealing with behind the scenes. Mm-hmm. I think that is what, again, from a distance, observing what's going on at the sanctuary out in Florida now, just thinking about and really praying for you and how this book is going to be received, which I think is going to be a bestseller. I think that more people, like, they need relatability. I remember saying this early on, like when I stepped into faith, at first, it was on the verge of a broken marriage, and I was just happy to hear that God was calling me home. Like that was amazing. But at some point I started to not be able to relate anymore, because it's like I was in a church environment where you weren't allowed to drink. Nobody said a single cuss word, at least not in public. Nobody ever had any real problems. The brokenness were just the testimonies of people coming forward. Life was changed and it's never broken again. And I was like, I am not that perfect. I'm screwed up. Like who's going to relate? If you haven't gone through the brokenness of marriage, you don't get it. Yes, you can point me to scripture and you can tell me all about how God wants to see unity in marriage and offers grace in the midst of it, but you don't get it. If you haven't been addicted in some way, shape, or form, you don't get what it's like to struggle with those things. For all the guys that are out there in this world right now struggling with lust, whether it's pornography or in the gym staring at the chick bending over, you don't get it if you're not willing to admit that you struggle with it too. Right. And so I think that is something that, like, this is what the church has been dying for. And I wish that you didn't have to go through what you did. It's heartbreaking to see the way you were treated, especially when it was fresh way back then, and to hear that people still hate on you now, though everybody hates on everybody all the time. But I feel like this was the Felix culpa, right? This was the beautiful fall that you needed to go through in order to show other people that there is hope for them. You're not their hope. And I know you say that all the time. Jesus is, but it's like, we need that. And I wish more churches would recognize the fact, that leadership would recognize that it's scary to go first. But if you don't, people won't go at all.
Yeah, and listen, I could not have said that better. That was remarkably said, and I'm in total agreement. The sad thing is, that's never going to happen. As honestly, which is I think like 10 years ago or so, I was on a mission to sort of move the needle of the church so that it would get back to being that churches would get back to being sanctuaries of grace. And safe places where broken people can break down and fallen people can fall down. And now I think I'm more of a realist than I used to be. And it's never going to happen. And I don't think that it's not happening in some places. Thank God it is. I can testify to the fact that it is happening here in Jupiter. And it's happening in a handful of other places that I'm aware of. But overall, the institution is so indoctrinated by moralism and this idea of the Christian life and Christianity in particular, that the focus of the Christian faith is the life of the Christian. And I still get comments about this all the time on social media and other places where I post things. People struggle with the idea, but shouldn't we be getting better? And then of course they define getting better in a very particular way, which means sinning less, however they define all that stuff. It's very subjective. And so there is the institute, the messaging, the predominant messaging that comes from Christian books, Christian music, churches, our theological seminaries, our magazines, whatever the case may be. The whole industry is so infused with this moralism that does not reflect Christianity to me that it's never going to happen. I'll give you an example. I was speaking at a men's retreat last year at this time. It was a large group of guys. And I had traveled to this place to speak. They invited me to speak. And it was a large Baptist church. And I was actually shocked that they had invited me to speak, to be honest with you. But they did. And I really connected with the guys. The whole weekend was amazing. There was one guy who happened to be on staff at this church who talked to me at different times throughout the weekend. And I can't say this for sure, but it was clear to me that this guy had some deep secrets in his life. He's married, 2 kids, but he had some secrets. I can kind of sniff that stuff these days in a way that I couldn't before. And yet he was in this, and I really liked this guy. Like, of all the guys that I met over the course of the weekend, he was the coolest. He was the guy I had the most honest conversations with. I really liked this guy a lot. But the church that he was a part of, I did the men's retreat on Friday and Saturday, and then I preached at their church on Sunday. And the feeling I got inside the church on Sunday was very different than the feeling I got Friday and Saturday with the guys. This was a traditional Southern Baptist church. Everybody looked happy. The way everybody talked about their lives was, peachy, and it didn't feel real to me. And I came home and I told my wife, and I said, I met this guy. And I said, it was very clear to me that this guy's got some secrets. And what typically happens with somebody who has secrets is that they have to, sort of indulge whatever it is they're engaged in privately in dark corners. And that stuff catches up with you. And eventually this guy's going to get exposed. And when he does, the church is going to be in shock. And they're going to kick him out. He's going to lose his job. They're going to be in complete shock. Like, how could you? And my response to that is, dude, you guys helped create the environment that made this guy feel radically unsafe to tell his secrets to anybody. Now, I know some people, their fear is not justified, and I get that. But in this particular case, knowing this guy, the little that I did, and knowing this church, the little that I did, I was like, there is no way in hell this guy would ever feel safe going to the leadership of this church and saying, guys, I need help. There's no way. Yep. And so I go, but that's the case with most churches, especially with church leaders. So the reason you're not getting a whole lot of honesty and transparency and rawness and realness from behind the pulpit is because if people get too real, if they get too raw, if they tell the truth about themselves too much, they will lose their jobs. And they need their job. They have bills to pay. They have a family to provide for. For them, especially for church leaders, church is the scariest place, to be honest. The scariest place. And I just, that's not going to change. I don't think that's going to change. In fact, I think cancel culture has kind of reinforced that. Because now everybody's out to get everybody, and the slightest screw up might cause you to get canceled. You'll lose your friends, you'll lose your family, you'll lose your job, you'll lose your reputation, you'll lose everything. So it almost seems safer to keep my secrets than to tell my secrets. Yeah. And that's why I so appreciate recovery places, because those are safe places for people to come clean. Yeah. And they're sitting around a circle with a whole bunch of other people who feel safe coming clean, and therefore nobody feels alone. They all feel like they're part of the same fraternity. And there is way more honesty that I've experienced in recovery places than any church I've ever been in. Way more honesty. And so I just, I mean, I'm so out of those circles now. I'm so far removed from that stuff. What we're doing at the sanctuary is, it's sort of like it's the redheaded stepchild over here. It's like the way I describe it for people. I was like, we're like a garage band. We're like an underground punk band, It's all noise to everybody on the outside, but to those on the inside, it's art, it's poetry, it's beauty. So, I'm just so far removed from that. And I've finally come to the realization that I don't think the church is ever going to change. And my friend Paul Zoll, the historian that he is, has reminded me that the message of grace has never been received in religious circles, ever. It wasn't received in Jesus' time. Paul and all of the disciples were killed for it. Martin Luther was excommunicated for it. And you see down throughout history when someone preaches the message of pure grace, people look at them with suspicion. People start questioning whether they're balanced, and they end up getting ostracized from whatever religious circles they're in. So since I've already been canceled, I don't give a shit anymore. That's really what it boils down to. So it's like Leonardo DiCaprio in The Revenant when he says, I'm not afraid to die because I'm dead already. That's exactly the way that I feel. So I'm like, that combined with the fact that when you understand that God loves you unconditionally, and God has proven that to me, that he does love unconditionally, when God loves you unconditionally, you're not nearly as concerned about everybody else liking you. And when you're not as concerned about everybody else liking you because you already have God's approval and you don't need their approval, then you're much more willing to tell the truth about yourself. Because if I tell you the truth about me and you go, okay, thanks for telling me, I'm out, that may bother me, but I'll be okay because God will never reject me. So, so it's sort of a combination of being canceled the way that I was and a real reckoning with God's unconditional love that gets me to a place where I can buddy up next to sinners. I mean, I got an email last night from somebody who told me that a prominent worship leader in a church that I had preached at a few times was fired because they discovered a long history of predatory behavior from this man with other men. And I know this guy. I knew this guy. I would have never guessed that. But I mean, as soon as I got it, just beginning to understand what this guy's about to go through. I mean, I texted him immediately and just said, dude, I don't know details. Just know that I love you. You're always welcome to come visit in Jupiter, blah, 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 blah. And I don't care if people attack me because of that stuff. Like, I want to gather up every fallen, broken, jacked up, guilty person who has ever been in church leadership. I want this to be a haven for them. I've told a group of men before, I said, if I was independently wealthy and could invest $10 million in a fund that would be able to bring all of these fallen pastors and broken church leaders to Jupiter and just get them into counseling, help them, sort of reconcile their marriages if there's even any reconciliation possible, and just pay them a nice salary so they don't have to worry about work right now, so they can just focus on their lives. I said I would do it in a second. And, I would get attacked for that because I was like harboring villains, harboring convicts. And I'm like, I don't give a shit. So, I don't think it's ever going to change. I wish it would. And I think we do have pockets where that's happening. And if you find a pocket where that's happening, stick with it. Hold on to it because it's very rare. It's very, very rare to find a place like that.
Yeah, it's good, man. All right. I think that's a good place to land the plane. I think that you have so well demonstrated. If no one's heard of you before and they're listening to this podcast, they got the same thing that I've gotten for the last 15 years following you and or so. And it is that God's grace is not just sufficient, but it is everything that we will ever need. And I love the fact that You went first. I know it was not an easy road to get there, but you did. I know that Carnage and Grace is going to be an incredible blessing for every single person that picks up that book. I have tried to live my life on this side of coming to faith in a similar sense of boldness. I want to be somebody that people can come to and feel comfortable with being honest about how screwed up they are, because it wasn't that I just was, but I still am. And so I can say, Tullian, that I love you for that, man. I appreciate and respect who you are, what you're doing, what you represent. I love the fact that you're a man's man crossfitting. I love that you deeply love your wife, Stacy. I love that you deeply love your kids. I love that you deeply love people, and that you have become a place where people can rest from this idea that we need to maintain a perfect life. So, dude, thank you for being you. Thank you for being on this podcast. Like, I cannot appreciate you enough.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Seriously, that means a lot. And I'm pretty picky and choosy about which podcasts I jump on. And I want to jump on podcasts where the conversations can be deep and rich and real, where I can be myself. And I knew that was going to be the case with you, and I greatly appreciate it. Thank you for what you're doing. I know we live on opposite ends of the country. I'm in South Florida. You're in Southern California. But you and your family are welcome here anytime.
I'll get to the sanctuary at some point on one of my Florida trips, man, for sure. We will make sure to put links to, I know Instagram, you are pretty regular there. Both the sanctuary is and you are individually. I would encourage you guys to go follow him. The messages that he continues to share and the words that he does are so encouraging and so needed. When is the book going to be released?
It's released on March 5th. People can pre-order it now on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever. I mean, it's all available for pre-order. I have 200 copies. I finally got my copy. I have 200 copies that we have a conference coming up called Fallen and Free, and I wanted to make sure I got at least 200 copies for the people who come to that conference. So they'll be the first ones to have it. But yeah, I'm looking forward to its release. The writing of this book was incredibly difficult. It was very healing, but incredibly painful. I had to revisit the darkest moments of my life and write about them with some perspective. I've never written a strict memoir before. I've written 7 other books, but none of them have been strict memoirs like this one. So it was a new genre for me in a lot of different ways. But man, I'm telling you, I mean, I had the help of an amazing editor by the name of John Blaze, who's a good friend, and really pulled stuff out of me that I would have rather kept concealed. So massive kudos to him. But I'm probably more proud of this work and feel more relieved now that it's done than anything I've ever done before. So I'm hoping that it serves as a beacon of hope to people who are feeling at the end of their rope.
Well, you said at the beginning of the book that writing a memoir was going to be a massive shit-eating contest. I think that you won, man. You did, at least, again, one man's opinion, but you did everything and then some in terms of what needed to be accomplished. And I just pray that not only do people pick this thing up, but they take it to heart and then they go do something with it with their own life. So thanks, again, Tullian, thank you so much, man. I appreciate you. You guys, click on the links, follow him. This podcast will be out just a few days before that book goes live on Amazon. So you'll get a chance to pre-order or order on the day of. Let's help this thing get to bestseller status. It needs to be out there. This is the message the world needs today. So once again, man, thank you. I appreciate you.
Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely.